Welcome to another episode of Local Government Insights Podcast, Modernizing Government Leadership, your source of insights for local government technology. My name is Allie Maynard. I'll be your host today, and today we're joined by Michael Huling. Today's episode is inspired by Michael's recent article, The Need for Strategic Economic Diversification. In this piece, Michael discusses why cities should avoid relying on a single industry and the importance of diverse economic strategies for sustainable growth. We're excited to hear Michael's insights today on how local governments can build resilient economies for long-term prosperity. Before we dive in, Michael, can you share a little bit about your background and what you're currently focused on at work?
Yeah, so I grew up in a town called Poway, California, which I proudly refer to as the best city in the world. I studied political science at UC San Diego as an undergraduate and then received my master's in public policy from Pepperdine University. I spent the past several years in various roles with the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and Civic Leadership. It's an institution that is housed at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. So I was a research assistant there while in grad school, a project manager and program trainer after graduating, and remained involved today as a member of the advisory council. Currently, I'm a senior planner in Clark County, Nevada, home of the famous Las Vegas Strip, but also encompassing about 8,000 square miles, which is an area that's greater than the state of New Jersey for comparison. So it's a very large and diverse region, not just in terms of the ethnic diversity, but the cultural, political, and even topographical diversity as well. I've been with the county for almost 2 years now, and it's truly a fascinating place to work. I work on a variety of land use and development projects ranging from residential subdivisions to commercial and industrial developments, and hopefully some big projects coming to the Strip in the near future, including the potential Oakland A's baseball stadium project.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. That's quite an impressive resume. I'm really excited to hear some of your thoughts and dive a little bit more into your article. And I kind of want to start today with can you please explain the concept of economic diversification, why it's so crucial for local governments?
Sure. So I'll start by outlining my conception of diversity. So, in simple terms, diversity means difference. When we talk about biodiversity, what we mean is an ecosystem or ecosystems that feature a multiplicity of species that are mutually dependent for their survival. Racial or ethnic diversity would be the presence of people and communities from different racial or ethnic backgrounds within the same population. Economic diversity is the presence of numerous economic sectors or business types within the same city, county, region, or other geographical area. We can also think about it in terms of business sizes, meaning a mixture of small, medium, and large businesses across different industries. Thus, economic diversification would entail adding to the local inventory of businesses in a manner that produces more variety in terms of the specific industries and also the relative size of the new businesses.
Great. Thank you so much for that explanation. And in your article, you had a very interesting comparison about economic diversification and a diversified investment portfolio.
Mhm.
Can you break that down for our listeners and explain how it applies to local economies?
Yeah, so I guess the original inspiration for my article was this piece published a few years back, which told the story of an investor who put pretty much all of his money into a single stock option. He was convinced that the stock would soar in value in the very near future and maintain that conviction even when the stock value began to decline, at which point he invested even more into it. Eventually, the stock collapsed completely and the investor lost everything. So the story resonated with me when I moved to the Las Vegas area and began thinking about our local economy and the degree to which it was over dependent on tourism and hospitality, a reality that was really highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the alternative investment strategy for both an individual investor and for a municipality is to avoid putting all your eggs in one basket and instead develop a diverse portfolio of assets. So for an individual, this might entail investing in a variety of stocks, bonds, real estate, so forth. And for a city or region, this would mean developing multiple industries with a mix of business types and sizes. Doing so provides the best hedge against the collapse of a particular stock or industry, which is largely unpredictable, especially in the short term, and allows for sustained resilient growth in the long term.
That's a great way to visualize it. Just like you wouldn't want to put all your savings into one stock, like that guy depicted in his article. Cities can also benefit from spreading out their economic activities. So thank you for that comparison. I really like that analogy. And you also mentioned some historic examples like the Rust Belt in your article. Could you elaborate on the long term effects that these regions face due to the lack of diversification?
Yeah, so in the article, I cite Timothy Carney's book, Alienated America: Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. And this book really impacted my thinking when I first read it several years ago when it was released, and it continues to influence my thinking today. Carney explains how numerous towns and cities throughout the Rust Belt were vibrant and prosperous during the industrial era, so through the 18th, 19th, and into the 20th century. You think of places like Flint, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. These cities had extremely productive manufacturing-based economies, um, along with, excuse me, along with strong neighborhoods and community institutions like churches and schools, all of which contribute to a really robust social and physical infrastructure. But as the country began to move away from domestic manufacturing for a variety of reasons related to automation, international trade, the comparative advantage of foreign manufacturing markets, and plenty of other causal factors that also played a role. So many of these great cities were unprepared for the kinds of changes that needed to be made in order to continue thriving. And they just didn't have the kind of economic diversification that would have allowed them to transition to an economy that was now prioritizing technology, medicine, healthcare, financial services, for example. In other words, they invested everything into one sector, into one industry, hoping or assuming that it would continue to grow, and that just didn't happen. But the damage to these places was not just economic, it was cultural and even spiritual. As the factories shut down, the schools, the churches, and the neighborhoods also suffered. We began to see the precipitous rise in deaths of despair, which are deaths linked to alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide. The economics matter a great deal, of course, but the consequences run so much deeper, and it's important that we don't lose sight of that we don't miss the forest for the trees. We aren't merely economic actors. These are people, these are families. And many of them have understandably felt abandoned since they've seen their communities collapse around them. The term economics has its origins in the Greek word oikonomia, which translates to household management. This is crucial for orienting us toward the understanding that the ultimate purpose of economies, the reason we should care about economic diversification and economic prosperity in the first place, is to support the families and communities that are the foundation for a flourishing civilization. That's what's at the heart of it all if we drill down to first principles, at least in terms of how I think about it.
That's a great point. And, just coming off what you just said, it is really striking how some of these regions that were once economic powerhouses can decline so dramatically without diversification. And when we think about these declines, it really seems like cultural and economic shifts often seemed intertwined.
Mhm.
How do you assess the role of cultural and economic changes in these downturns?
Yeah, so it's difficult to say for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's so context dependent. The agricultural revolution presented different challenges and opportunities than did the industrial revolution. The impacts of the Great Depression can only be compared to the Great Recession so much. And that's just comparing different historical events or historical periods. Different places respond to the same crisis also varies dramatically. During the pandemic, which caused a severe economic downturn really everywhere, we saw different cities, states, and nations take extremely divergent approaches in response. And I think that can largely be attributed to their unique cultures and their political leadership. The way that, say, West Fargo and North Dakota responded to the pandemic was quite different than Los Angeles, as you might imagine. And the second reason why it's hard to assess is that it's often a chicken or the egg question. Were the cultural changes that led to that caused the economic changes, or did economic change affect the culture? So surely there are cases where it's a bit of both, and the cultural and economic changes coincided with each other, such that they evolved together. I think many of the early American colonies would fall into this category as they developed certain habits of self-government in the context of their communities, allowing for organic cultural and economic innovations and developments to emerge as they sort of accumulated generational wisdom and experience. This is probably common if we examine, cultures and economies over a long period of time, anywhere and at any time historically. But you also have clear cases where the culture reshaped economies, which I think is fair to say about the Protestant Reformation and the kinds of values and virtues that became embodied in the Protestant work ethic. On the other hand, there are scientific breakthroughs that create a sort of punctuated equilibrium where dramatic change happens rapidly and then sort of steadies in the long term. You think of how the printing press affected literacy and the cultural implications of that, or what Newtonian physics did to lay the foundation for industrialization, which fundamentally changed not just our culture, but human civilization. So I think the point is that human cultures and economies, they are intertwined, as you alluded to, and it's almost impossible to change one without influencing the other.
That's a great point. Thank you, Michael. Another point that you brought up in your article is the example of Las Vegas and how the city managed to diversify its economy beyond tourism. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, living and working in the Las Vegas area is also part of what forced me to begin thinking more seriously about economic diversification. The region was utterly devastated by the Great Recession of the late 2000s, as the financial crisis wiped out the disposable income of so many people, which tends to stop you from doing things like traveling, gambling, and the other kinds of activities that a tourism-based regional economy really relies on. That was certainly the case in Las Vegas. It took nearly a decade for the region to fully recover from the recession, which was much longer than pretty much any other metropolitan area in the country that you could point to. And unsurprisingly, the pandemic also had a huge impact on the Vegas Valley, causing billions of dollars in losses in visitor spending and tourist spending, and hundreds of thousands of tourism and hospitality based jobs. So, what I found to be really interesting as I kind of examined and compared these two periods was how swift the local economy recovered after the pandemic compared to the recession. And what I quickly learned is that I'm not the first one who has thought about the need for the Southern Nevada region to diversify its economy. This has been a real focus across the region and even across the state for at least a decade. Several jurisdictions, including the cities of Las Vegas, Henderson, and Clark County, where I work, have emphasized economic diversification in their long-term master plans and their economic development plans, prioritizing new industries such as manufacturing and logistics, technology, autonomous vehicles, clean energy, healthcare, life sciences, finance, retail, the list goes on. And this has also been reflected in changes to land use and zoning policies, which often impose huge obstacles on the ability of certain sectors to establish themselves by arbitrarily restricting where they can be located and what they can do operationally. So I think we still have a very long way to go in terms of reforming what I like to call the zoning and regime and moving past the imposition of arbitrary lines, to borrow a term from Nolan Berry's book. And these lines, these zoning barriers, ultimately they divide, where we live from the things that we'd like to do, and curtail the kinds of organic business development that would allow for economic diversification to flourish naturally. But we're moving in the right direction in Vegas and across the state. And you've seen other parts of the state kind of follow suit, mirroring what Southern Nevada has done. Manufacturing has grown rapidly in the Vegas Valley in the last few years, to the point where we're now, I think, a national leader in industrial development, with many major projects still on the way. Intergovernmental partnerships have also been crucial in our state. The state government has offered tax incentives to attract new business sectors, which led to Tesla selecting Nevada for its lithium-ion battery gigafactory, which is located in the northern part of the state. So there's much work to be done, but we definitely made a lot of progress as a region and as a state in terms of building a more diverse, sustainable, and a resilient economy.
Oh, that's very interesting. And I think Las Vegas is a perfect example for other communities, kind of showing how you can change, you can turn a challenge into an opportunity for reinvention. So thank you for sharing your perspective on that. I know that that's close and dear to your heart since it's your home state. Another city that's done this well is Pittsburgh, which has really transformed over the years. What are some of the strategies you've seen implemented in Pittsburgh that moves beyond its traditional industries?
Yeah, so Pittsburgh is a fascinating case study for me because it's one of those major Rust Belt cities that was absolutely devastated by the decline in manufacturing. It's a city that lost over half of its population between 1950 and 2000, which is astonishing to me. And yet, after decades of sustained population loss, economic stagnation, cultural malaise, Pittsburgh really has come roaring back. It does have the luxury of having several really renowned universities, the proper utilization of which has been, I think, instrumental in its recovery. Carnegie Mellon University, for instance, has a world renowned robotics institute that was established back in the 1970s, 1980s, and since led to the establishment of the National Robotics Engineering Center and Carnegie Robotics. So these institutions have contributed immensely to robotics, engineering, technology, autonomous vehicles, but they've also helped transform Pittsburgh from a former manufacturing hub to really a present and future center for innovation in technology and engineering. The city's capitalized on its academic resources and created a pipeline that allows graduates to easily transition into their profession while remaining in the city that they love and the city that they've come to call home. And while engineering and robotics have become, major industries for Pittsburgh, they're far from the only sectors that are thriving in that local economy. So between its world-class universities, upstart industries, and old school professional sports teams that play a big role in kind of the cultural identity there, Pittsburgh seems to have found a way to preserve that identity while also adapting to a changing world.
That's a great point. And it seems like public private partnerships seem to be essential in this kind of transformation. You discussed this briefly, but can you kind of discuss the role of education and workforce deployment in supporting new industries?
Yeah, so I think public-private partnerships can be extremely beneficial for sure, and they often go hand in hand with education and workforce development. So I've already mentioned Pittsburgh, but just to reiterate that the collaboration between the city government, its universities, and its local businesses was pivotal for the city's revitalization and has created a cohesive environment for more partnerships in the future. Another example is South Bend, Indiana, which is another Rust Belt city that suffered for decades after its manufacturing-based economy weakened in the 20th century. But under Mayor Pete Buttigieg's leadership in the 2010s, the city, really rediscovered itself as an innovation and technology hub. And like Pittsburgh, the city worked closely with its university, the University of Notre Dame, with local businesses, chambers of commerce, and with other municipalities in the region. And this culminated in the South Bend Elkhart Regional Partnership, which now features dozens of communities that are collaborating on all kinds of topics and projects, including innovation districts, place-based development, workforce development, resident attraction and retention, and so much more. South Bend, I think, has really reaped the benefits, experiencing economic growth and stabilization while attracting many new businesses and industries that really give the city an opportunity to continue growing, not just economically, but culturally too. And while not every city has an excellent university to work with, I think there are lessons that any city or region can learn from the successes of Pittsburgh and South Bend, and then modify or apply them to suit their own unique context.
Absolutely. I think those are great examples as well. I kind of want to shift over now to overcoming challenges in diversification. Many cities encounter resistance, and whether that's from industries or even the public when they're trying to diversify. What are some of the common barriers that you've seen, and how can local governments overcome them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to look at it in two ways. So, first, the internal barriers that we face within municipal government, and second, being the external barriers that may come from the general public, from established businesses and industries, as you alluded to. There's a tendency for people in government, and especially in my field of planning and development, to think that we know best how a neighborhood, how a city or a region should develop. We spend every day working in our community and thinking about these issues, and therefore think that we are best equipped to solve them. And I think there are, clear problems with this attitude and general disposition. The first of which is that it lacks humility. And while we may see ourselves as experts and benevolent ones at that, the reality is that human cultures and economies are far too complex for an individual expert or institution to have all the answers. This gets to what economist Frederick Hayek called the knowledge problem, which is rooted in the recognition that no single person or single institution can come close to matching the dispersed knowledge and experience of the masses, which is accumulated through generations of real world experience, culminating into what Aristotle might call practical wisdom. James Scott writes about this in his book, Seeing Like a State, brilliantly, in which he details numerous examples of how hyper-rationalist modernist technocrats around the world have attempted to impose a top-down vision to reorganize societies as they saw fit. In places like Brasilia and Tanzania, central planners ignored centuries of local customs and traditions, including things like agricultural practices, neighborhood design, and they did so to the dismay and the detriment of those communities. A lot of these attempts to intervene led to, famine, led to dramatically decreasing crop yields, cultural and political collapse due to the growing distrust of political leaders and institutions, and all kinds of other consequences. So the practical knowledge of the locals and their environment, including how the seasons affect the soil, which crops can be harvested at certain times of year, and in which areas, based on things like the slopes of the hillsides or the seasonal patterns. These are things you cannot understand unless you actually live and work in this particular place. So when we're trying to achieve things like economic diversification, I think it's paramount that we acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge and work with the people who are doing business in our cities, and work with the people who and better understand the kinds of challenges that come with running a successful business, and know the neighbors and customers in a way that we simply can't as planners or bureaucrats. And the same holds true when we're discussing the external barriers to diversification. Excuse me. Some of the external barriers that come maybe from those same business owners that we're trying to work with, that we're trying to assist. And we may strongly believe that our city needs to add X or Y industry based on our research, based on our experience, in order to diversify and to offer new opportunities for growth. But without engaging the stakeholders in our communities, we're making decisions with incomplete information. And we're essentially taking the public out of public policy. So it's important that we collaborate with businesses, universities, nonprofit organizations, and the public to inform our economic strategies while also building trust through transparency. One major concern from existing businesses or industries may be that, with diversification comes new competition, and that may make things more difficult for them, which certainly can be true. But I think that's a feature, not a bug, and it's important to communicate that. We want the competition because it's what allows for creativity and innovation to flourish, within the economic marketplace. But I'd also say that, some sectors naturally are not competing with others. Expanding the medical sector, for instance, for new educational programs or, recruitment efforts is not going to negatively impact, tourism, for example. This is a big thing for us in the Las Vegas Valley. So a lot of these industries are really more complementary than they are competitive. As you attract more people to work in one industry, they naturally have more income, more opportunity to invest through their spending practices, their activities in other industries. And lastly, when it comes down to it, the common good of the community, I think, does take precedence over the interests of a particular corporation or industry. So we shouldn't hamstring our economies just for the sake of protecting specific corporate interests. But again, the overlying point to me is that a diversified local economy is ultimately a win for everyone, especially in the long term.
I completely agree. And that's so nice to hear. It's so important to listen to all stakeholders. And it's great to hear that from a city planner like yourself. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective on that. And another point here is I wanted to kind of get into how to prepare for the future. Given the unpredictability of the economics disruptions like pandemics or advancements in technology, how can cities plan to ensure economic resilience?
Yeah, I think this is also a tricky question because on the one hand, sometimes there is nothing you can really do to be adequately prepared for unexpected disasters. The pandemic was, an obvious example of this. And although you could certainly argue that some places were better prepared or more responsive to the changing circumstances than others, you'd be hard pressed to find any major city that wasn't significantly disrupted. And this is also true of natural disasters, of course. You can't predict the next massive earthquake or hurricane or tornado. But there are things you can do in terms of disaster preparedness, environmental mitigation, And yes, I would add economic diversification as well, particularly as you move past that kind of initial shock or devastation and into the recovery development phase that follows. With technological change, it's a little different because it's obviously a more gradual development than the natural disasters where you have sometimes no notice, sometimes maybe a few days. But you compare that to America's shift away from manufacturing following World War II, which did not happen overnight, even if it felt like that in some places. It was a gradual trend over the span of decades in which industrial production actually continued to grow, but the number of manufacturing jobs needed to contribute to that production declined largely due to more complex and efficient machinery that allowed for large-scale automation. And again, some of the other causes that I alluded to before. We'll probably be seeing something very similar with artificial intelligence now. And in the coming years, it's likely to impact a wide variety of industries. And while personally I'm a bit of a skeptic of the idea of infinite technological progress and even the desire for it, if you aren't thinking about and preparing for the changes that AI is going to bring, I think you're setting yourself up for failure. If most or all of your economic resources are invested in a sector that is likely going to experience mass disruption in the years to come, which is certainly very possible in content and media-based industries. You're already seeing that with ChatGPT. It's going to be a painful adjustment if you aren't prepared for that. The economic landscape will change. Some industries will shrink, others will grow, some may disappear entirely, and new ones are also sure to emerge, all of which is part of what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. So for leaders in cities and counties, we can ignore it, we can complain about it, or we can exercise prudence and prepare for the future using the institutional knowledge that we already have, identify and develop sectors that are likely to grow in the coming years, and again, collaborate with our universities, our local businesses, and other organizations that truthfully all are going to play a crucial role in ensuring that we're in a position to embrace the future, confusing and unpredictable as it might be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Preparing for the unexpected is definitely challenging, but it's also something that cities need to prioritize, and especially in today's fast-changing world. And as you described with AI, we're seeing that rapidly develop so quickly and become part of our everyday lives. Um, and for cities looking to diversify their economies, what are some of the first steps that they can take?
Yeah, so I think you have to start with an honest assessment of where you are now. How diverse and how robust is your local economy? How is it truly working for the families that make up your community? Which industries are strong, which are weak or non-existent? Where's the potential for growing the existing industries and or attracting new ones? Where are the undeveloped or underdeveloped parts of the region, and what can be done there? What are the current obstacles that have prevented or limited economic growth and diversification? How are things like zoning restrictions and other land use regulations negatively impacting the business environment? How difficult are we making it for small and large businesses alike to get started, and how can we improve there? So I think it's always useful to see what other cities or regions have done and see what you can apply in your own municipal context. That's why I think it's really worthwhile to spend time understanding these transformation success stories in places like Pittsburgh, like South Bend, like Las Vegas, because I think they really are informative and also instructive. It's why I focus so much on them. It's not because I think Las Vegas or Clark County should copy exactly what these other cities are doing. Our history, our culture, our politics, our economy are different than theirs. We should embrace what makes this place uniquely ours, not despite all of its oddities and eccentricities of Las Vegas, but because of them. And there's a lot to learn from the other jurisdictions, and then you tweak it to suit your particular circumstances. You take what's useful and applicable for you, and discard the rest of it. And a big part of that is identifying the resources that may be available to you. What role can universities, businesses, nonprofits, neighboring cities and regions, and the state government, and in some cases even the federal government, what role can they all play? What kinds of relationships and partnerships are possible there? So I think these are the kinds of questions that you have to ask and eventually answer if you want to diversify your economy in a way that is feasible and sustainable, while also maintaining, fidelity to the community that you serve with its particular history, its particular culture, that constitutes its identity.
I think that's very practical advice. And I think many of our listeners will find that helpful when they kind of think of their own communities and see what's going on outside their communities and how that can relate to their communities. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for sharing all your insights today. I think some of the biggest takeaways here were that economic diversification is crucial for resilience, and public private partnerships are vital, and cities need to be proactive about planning for future disruptions. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. And for those who are interested in learning more, where can listeners find more of your work and resources on economic diversification?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. You can read more of my work, and I see Ms. PM Magazine, where I often contribute. As far as learning more about economic diversification, I would start with what your city, county, or region is doing. Reach out to your local planning or economic development department and see what they're working on. You might be surprised. I'd say the same for universities that are in your area, as many of these institutions, they are beginning to think more seriously about preparing students for the 21st century economy, and in some cases, really tailoring it to the city or region in which they're located. There are several other great institutions that are working diligently to strengthen our cities through improved planning and development strategies. Strong Towns, the Congress for the New Urbanism, both wonderful organizations that are doing great work on these fronts. So it's an important issue for all the reasons that we've discussed today. And thankfully, there are a lot of smart and talented people out there that are working on it. So it's an exciting time also.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing more of your work in the future. And thank you to our listeners. Stay tuned for more government insights, and we look forward to having you next time. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you so much.